with my colleagues in the alumni team. I could not do this without them. Equally, what a treat to have you as an audience joining today. Thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure to talk pure gardening, that of horticulture. I have your garden questions waiting for me as the hour goes on. I'm aware of that. However, as per the format today, we thought it might be useful to have a few pictures from the Botanic Gardens taken yesterday, fresh as fresh, to prime you with regards to various gardening activities that you need to consider, maybe small scale, maybe large scale, for autumn, as it now is looming, and into winter. Indeed, some of the tasks I'm going to highlight to you, you have time now between arguably mid-October through to end of March, and depending where you are in the UK, that will differ. Possibly some of you are calling in, listening in from overseas, in which case there'll be further variation as well. To our first picture here, this is our Pendulous Ash. It's on the end of our peninsula bed as you come through from the formal pedestrian Chenery entrance. And I've taken this very deliberately because A, you will notice it's still in leaf. B, you will notice it is beginning to show a bit of open canopy. Now, as an ash tree, it happens to be pendulous, there is a potential double concern here. It could just be early leaf drop on some of the limbs, and that's fine. Here we are into autumn, and give it a matter of weeks and or a few more high winds, a few more days of high wind, strong gusts, and it may well be showing its deciduous shape and form until next growing season. However, it's an ash tree, and tragically throughout Britain now we have ash dieback moving through the countryside, moving through botanic specimens and street trees combined. I should add that this is all focusing on ash, Fraxinus excelsior. The North American ash trees are, the Asian ash trees, blessedly, are not susceptible to this disease. We have been monitoring this ash here for the last 3 years. It is possible what we're seeing now is early onset of ash dieback. And the reason I've taken this picture for today's talk is as an aide-memoire to all of us. If we have concern about a tree picking up a specific disease or a shrub, and we don't know if it's going to be impacted over the dormant period, then take a picture now or earlier in the growing season when it's in full leaf, so that you then have a visual comparison next year. And we will do exactly that. Indeed, we do that with some of our trees, including this ash specimen. So use pictures. So easy today with almost everyone carrying a so-called smartphone and having a camera ready at hand. Very easy to keep a visual record of some of your plants. If there's any questions about this, please ask now. Otherwise, Chloe will move on to the next slide. Autumn cyclamen, lovely to have coming through at the base of one of our trees. Cyclamen grow from a corm, a storage it's not a tuber, but botanically speaking it is a corm, but it's the storage unit from the plant. It looks a little bit like a donut with a center that is recessed but doesn't have a hole going all the way through. I put this in again more as an aide-memoire to all of us. We're at that wonderful stage of the year where we get some bulbous material, bulbs, corms, tubers, that group of plants. We get some that will be flowering now, but many of our lovely bulb plants that we enjoy across the UK are winter bulbs or spring bulbs. Certain cultivars of daffodil flowering all the way through to May. But this is the time, if you want to add winter or spring bulbs to your garden, this is the time to buy them. This is the time to get them in the ground. That's not to say I always get them in the ground in time at home, but ideally they're going to be planted by the end of November. But they are tolerant of, so long as you've stored them well and they're not running off, they are tolerant of being planted as late as mid-January, but they won't necessarily come into flower quite when you expect. But yeah, this time now, end of November, bulb planting is your ideal autumn project for spring and winter colour. Again, unless there's any questions, next slide, please. I'm smiling slightly at this picture. I deliberately took it to remind us of the acronym DDDC, 3DC, triple DC. And that acronym stands for dead, diseased, damaged, and crossing. And that happens to be a viburnum that has died off. And so it falls within some of those letters that I've referred to. But for deciduous plants right now, and again, you have time as leaf drop occurs now through to bud break next year, so really through to end of March, to go out, look at your trees, look at your shrubs, and try and establish what is dead, what limbs are dead. In this case, it's the whole plant, and we need to take it down at ground level. But that's not the point of this visual exercise today. What limb is dead? Can that be cut out or cut back? What is diseased? Hopefully not the whole plant. Again, disease might be indicative of one of the limbs having died back. Damaged through possibly animal damage, herbivory, but otherwise wind damage. Again, a snap limb, a broken limb, one that's hanging in the canopy, and then crossing limbs, and the notion of taking out some limbs that might be perfectly healthy, but to reduce crossing, reduce the opportunity for crossing, allowing more air movement through your plant once it's back in leaf. That will then help, broadly speaking, with less build-up of other seasonal diseases. Powdery mildew for certain plants is a case in point, not necessarily with trees and shrubs, but it's a classic with regards to not having enough air movement through. But if you take out some of the limbs and they're not, therefore your canopy is not as dense, not only do you get better air movement through, but arguably more light levels are coming through to the remaining branches, stems, and leaves. So you're getting an overall healthier plant. But again, for deciduous plants, winter months, go out there, check your plants, and look for dead, diseased, damaged, and/or crossing limbs, and have a good, sharp saw, possibly loppers as well, to then take out what you need. If there's no questions on that, next slide. This is in full leaf. This is our informal herbaceous. Let's start again. It is in full leaf. It's our informal hedgerow. We have quite a few hedgerows throughout the Botanic Garden, but this is deliberately planted as an informal hedgerow. It also has certain plants in it that have been layered. In other words, the stems have been cut through about 8/10 and then very carefully pulled down, laid horizontally. There's still that remaining vascular tissue will allow sap and water to move through the plant in the growing season, but you get new branches growing upwards and over time create a wonderful dense hedge that is both horizontal and vertical in design. This mixed hedgerow has a good range of species in it. Field maple, rose, ash, holly, blackthorn, the list goes on. What you're seeing in the foreground here are young seedling saplings of elm, Ulmus glabrous, Scots elm, and again, lovely to have as young plants in the hedgerow here, because the mature trees, again, tragically across much of Scotland, are now being killed off by Dutch elm disease. But I put this slide in because once all of the deciduous plants in here have lost their leaves, we're back to the acronym as per the previous slide. But right now, it's an opportune moment to possibly trim back some of these stems just because you recognize that they've grown out too much already. Do it now. The leaves are going to drop shortly. There's no harm to the plant, and you're doing it while it's in leaf, and you're having a good visual record of width and height before the new growing season. And if you don't do it now, it'll only grow out further once again if you're not staying on top of of the management of the informal hedge itself. If there's no questions on that, another slide, please. This is the herbaceous border, and if you haven't visited the Botanics recently, you no doubt remember that this is one of the great beds, great displays in the Botanics. It's 87 meters long, it's 5 meters wide, 15 foot wide, over 270 foot long. It's a very, very fine herbaceous border. We've now split it into thirds because we have two pathways that cut through perpendicular in a perpendicular manner, but you don't see those paths until you almost bump into them. It's a huge display, and as with herbaceous plants, by definition, botanically speaking, they are plants that will grow up to whatever their species height is, but all through turgor pressure. There's no formal secondary tissue, no outer bark layer, and then the plants will die down, naturally have a dormant period in the depths of winter, and regrow from the same rootstock. Herbaceous plants in a horticultural, in a gardening context, then need to be lifted and split for that vigor to continue. In a wild context, it is the center that will die out and the new growth is always on the outer perimeter. In a horticultural context, we want that dead material in the middle to become less apparent. So on average, every 3 to 5 years, you're getting into your herbaceous border and you're lifting, you're splitting the good material you replant or move to a new location, the old material in the center you're composting. If you're not on that 3 to 5 year cycle, what is necessary with herbaceous is to cut it down. In our case, through management, staffing levels, weather as well, and weeding that we may not have been able to get on top of during the height of the growing season. By middle of November, we may begin to be cutting back some of the herbaceous border, but that is a project that can again go all the way through to March. Some of the material, if it's kept upright longer, provides seed and habitat, food and habitat for different animals, particularly some passerine birds. So there's a biodiversity element to this. Cut it down to ankle height, and you may need to mulch as well or feed the soil. That could be a top dressing or digging in compost. Another slide if there's no questions. There's another image, much closer image of the herbaceous border. You're actually looking at double planks there holding back one of the cut through pathways, and the stake you see in the foreground there, timber stake, actually has a cleat on top, and that's a corner point for netting. We pull netting across about 1 meter above ground level for the plants to grow through and to stabilize through the growing season, makes our life much easier. But you can see just above the plank level there, the soil level, that's what we'll be cutting the herbaceous material down to. It really is, I say ankle height, in many cases it's lower than that. If you are relatively new to herbaceous borders and you put in stakes through the growing season and you're now about to wade in there and cut down, please, please, please wear safety glasses. The number of near misses or worse incidents that have occurred where you don't see a bamboo cane you put in there because it just blends in with the autumn stem tissue and suddenly it's coming up into your face or worse into your eye. Terrifying. Do be careful. That goes for all of us, professionally, amateur, doesn't matter. Be careful. Again, next slide, please. Aha, look at that for a fairly miserable bit of lawn. If you visit the Botanic Gardens for our lawns, then I don't mind suggesting you're coming for the wrong reason. Our lawns across the Botanics are very much a medium of access, and they are a foil to the formal beds and the rest of the shrub and tree collection. What you're seeing here is remnants from damage 11 months ago with Storm Arwen. We had a pine tree in one of our central lawns come crashing down. Its root mass came up, and it's been a long, gradual process to get rid of the root mass, get rid of all the additional timber, backfill the large hole it created, and so with grass. In this case, you can see that we've had some bare patches. We've had a very dry summer. I'm sure many of you have as well. Not all of the seed germinated. And so it's a case of coming back and oversowing. This is still an opportune time of the year to do it, which might be a confusion for some. But remember, while air temperature, particularly in the evenings, is now beginning to get colder, we're still dealing with a warm soil. And for small patches like this, doesn't hurt to oversow now. We're getting good rain, autumn rain. Chances are, over the next 4 weeks, that seed will germinate, and you should be able to allow that to carry on through the winter months, ready to really succeed successfully in the spring. Conversely, of course, if you do a little bit of oversowing now and it doesn't take to the density or germination success rate you're hoping, hopefully you have less open soil to contend with, and you can oversow again come spring as the soil warms up. Day length improves, air temperature improves as well. If there's no questions on that, next slide. Along one of our buildings, happens to be the Cruickshank building, one of the lab wings here, and next to it a very narrow bed, and it allows for a significant climber to be growing up against the wall. The root mass is in there. We've got some hypericum in the foreground there, we've got some wallflowers, and it's underplanted with daffodils. But the focus for this slide is really the leaf litter there. Autumn is upon us. I've stated it time and again. You're aware of that, and so leaves as they fall will, with wind eddies, collect in various locations. What's interesting with this position is to then decide when those leaves get lifted. I should add, at the Botanics, we collect all our leaves. They go onto a specific leaf compost area, and they get turned once a year, and in their third year they've rotted down, referred to as leaf mold, to a wonderful friable material, and we then use that as our basis for making our own potting mixes. In this case, the leaf litter here doesn't have to be collected up immediately. You could use it as a natural mulch. You've got bulbs underneath, and they will force through come spring. It means you have less open soil, potentially less opportunity for any perennial or ephemeral weed seed to come in and germinate in the winter months. It's a way of reducing your workload. Next slide, please. I mentioned leaf litter there as a possible mulch. Well, here is a bark mulch. You can see that there's a bit of a bare patch near the collar zone, near the trunk and soil zone itself. We need to top up the mulch there, but it's an opportune image to remind all of us that mulching a bed or putting a tree mulch, a tree ring around the base of a tree, can be a very opportune way of suppressing weeds germinating or weed seed blowing in, possibly perennial weeds growing up through. They've got to work harder to get through the mulch. They're therefore easier for us to weed. But the mulch itself, particularly if it's an organic mulch like this, a bark mulch, will slowly rot down and feed the soil. But more importantly, a mulch helps retain moisture in the soil. And if you're concerned or wish to experiment with certain plants you have in the soil that are possibly a little tender, but you think you can get away with keeping them in the ground over winter, not lifting them, before frost comes in, before the soil temperatures do drop, get a good mulch over the top of those plants, and it will act as a little bit of an insulator, with the added benefit as we get into our new growing season next year, it'll slowly rot down. If it's an organic mulch, feed the soil and feed the root mass of those plants, but put it down now to help retain some of the moisture and some of the heat, residual heat in the soil, as we move into mid and the back end of autumn. Another question, another slide, please. I think this is the last. You're looking here at the yellow fruiting form as opposed to the red of the Guelder rose, Viburnum opulus, a lovely shrub. But a reminder to all of us that this is the time of year particularly to collect seed if you wish. And I've deliberately chosen fruit here that have a fleshy outer membrane. Of course, from the plant standpoint, this is trying to advertise to a bird to come along and enjoy the fruit, swallow the seed, have it have the seed go through the bird's gut, and therefore hopefully a new plant will, through its seed, be germinating elsewhere away from the parent plant. In our context, if you collect seed like this, you need to get the outer flesh off. So you can use kitchen towel, but a table with newspaper on it is the best way, the easiest way. Squeeze, it's a bit of a messy job, but a very satisfying one. You'll feel the seed in the center, squeeze it out from the fleshy pulp, discard the pulp, try and clean off the seed as efficiently as you can, leave it in a tray or on a separate membrane that you can easily see the seed against, and it'll need to dry over a number of days. But once you've got the mucilaginous outer membrane off that in this case the yellow outer membrane, once the seed is clean and dry, into a brown paper packet, color is immaterial, brown packet, frost free, often in a chest of drawers will work a treat for you. Make sure it's well labeled, and those seeds should be viable certainly for the next growing season, possibly longer. You collect seed now, it might be viable for 2024 as well, depending on the plant. But germination rate might drop a little. But time of year, seed collecting now. Those are my opening 10 slides as a conversation piece, and now I greatly look forward to your own questions. Chloe, I don't know if you're vetting the questions or whether I'm expected to see them on this occasion. Apologies, but I don't have anything coming in yet. Flopping colchicums is the question I see there. Colchicum autumnali is the wonderful autumn crocus, and it's a little different than most of our spring or autumn bulbs, because as a plant it doesn't send up leaf and flower at the same time. You get the wonderful fleshy leaves in spring, sometimes also known as the naked crocus you get in flower now with no leaves, so it comes up looking beautiful right now. It's quite tall in height, and some that have been played with, some of the cultivars possibly even taller with a slightly bigger flower as well. But we're talking up to 20 centimeters, about 18 inches or so perhaps in height sometimes. A pale stem, often pink petals. It's a lovely plant, and I'm always surprised here at the Botanics to see that it's coming into flower by late August, early September. It always feels so much earlier than the month of October when I expect it. And that's really, I think, the point to your question. I don't think there is anything you can easily do to stop the flower head drooping. What's happening is it's coming to the end of its life cycle. Flowering in autumn is a deliberate evolutionary adaptation from the plant standpoint, because it's not competing with spring pollinators. Hopefully there's, in the plant's context, more pollinators around very late summer, early autumn. The minute pollination occurs, so the flower is, or the plant is then putting energy into producing seed. The flower itself doesn't need to stay upright, it begins to collapse. But if you're concerned that there's more to your issue than that, then do give them a good feed, a good nitrogen feed when they're in leaf in spring, because that's when the plant is taking energy back down into the bulb for autumn flowering. I saw something about fruit trees popping up on the screen, but sorry, I didn't read.
I'm going to check if you can hear me okay.
I can, Chloe.
Yay, okay, perfect. We're using the good old mobile phone. So apologies to everyone so much for my connection issues. I think lesson learned. I will continue to do my events from home and not try and do them in the office. I think where we're based, the Wi-Fi and things aren't great. So I'm glad that everyone can now hear me, and thanks so much for your patience. And thank you, Mark, for taking us through the slides and providing a kind of overview of the things that happen at the gardens here. So I will do what I should have done to begin with, and yeah, I can kind of read out the questions that are popping in. Thanks to everyone for putting them into the chat. So June's asking, I know you haven't covered fruit trees, but our pear tree flowered but didn't produce fruit this year and does not seem to be thriving where it is it possible to move it, and is this a good time to move it, and how, if it is?
Sorry, and who sent that in, Chloe?
June.
June, thank you for your question. June, if you've heard the news this morning on the radio, you must be doubly annoyed with what you've had to write and ask me about, because the RHS was being interviewed this morning, waxing lyrical about fruit, in particularly apples, in great abundance across Britain this summer, this autumn, because of the lack of frost when most apples were in flower in spring, and the wonderful hot summer that has prolonged, allowing much of the soft fruit of Britain, apples and pears, to develop in great quantity, in larger size than normal. That doesn't help you. Your pear tree, I don't know if it can be moved. That depends on the size of the plant. I would suggest that if it's more than 10 years old, I would suggest that it would be too stressful for the plant to be moved, unless you do everything absolutely right and have the machinery to move what would be quite a sizable plant at that point. If it's younger than that, then look at it as a 2-year process. There's always a risk that this will kill the plant off. So without seeing it and knowing where you are, I give this advice with caution. But this autumn into winter, undercut the plant. So dig a trench around the base of the root mass, roughly the width of the canopy of the tree above, the drip line of the branches above. Dig a trench around, dig underneath. The plant is dormant at this stage, there's no leaves, so you're not going to cause dramatic damage. And what we've done by undercutting it is cause the plant, come the next growing season, to send out a mass of new fibrous roots. Give it the whole growing season next year to live off those fibrous roots, and then in a year's time, 12 to 14 months time, lift the whole plant with the new fibrous mass. Also prune the plant back by a third. As you undercut on this occasion, prune it back by a third so that there's less leaf mass for the next growing season, less shock to the overall plant. But that is a process that would allow you, through undercutting, to move the plant. As for not getting any pears this year, how disappointing for you. There's a number of reasons, but if it fruits regularly year on year, it may be that, regardless of what the RHS was saying on the radio this morning, your fruit, your pear tree did have frost when it was in flower. If the flowers get frosted, they can't get pollinated, you won't get your fruit.
Perfect, thank you. Our next question, I use horse manure from hayfield stables as a fertilizing mulch. However, I've read that preventative worming medication given to horses can make their manure bad for soil organisms and worms. Is this an issue?
Now I need to talk to my sister. She's a great horsewoman. We know that medication that is given to animals goes through their own food chain, goes through their gut, and we know that some of these chemicals can then end up in a residual manner in the manure in this context. I don't know is the very simple answer to your question as to whether it has a noticeable impact to the health of your soil. I think it would have to be a vast volume being given to the horses, and you in turn would be having to use a vast volume of manure for any impact in the soil. I also don't know what visual signs it would show on the plants through that medication. What I would say about horse manure is that, if you're lucky enough to have some available, good on you, because there's nothing better for improving and feeding your soil. Classic material to dig in part of my training decades ago. Double digging, it's not called bastard digging for a reason when you're doing 2 trenches worth down into the ground, but you would layer that with horse manure. So a good 60 centimeters, a good 2 foot below soil level, and it would really enrich and feed the soil. If you're not doing that sort of digging, and I don't encourage that, it's excessive work, just make sure the horse manure is very well rotted down. That's really the key, and you may need to store it for a year before you use it. It all depends how fresh it is from the horse yard. I don't have any available myself, but if I did in my own garden at home, I'd be putting it on the compost heap. I'd be using it as a improver to help break down all the rest of the organic material I put on the compost. That's another way of using it.
Cool, thank you. Gary, who's a member of our team, he put a question in. He says you kind of have answered this already, because he was also asking about his plum tree and was asking about pruning the branches, but he's also asked, we hardly got any brambles this year, but lots of new shoots. Again, how far should these be cut back?
I'm surprised to hear that the brambles didn't do well. They're normally a very reliable, tough plant. And assuming we're dealing with brambles, as in blackberries and not raspberries, then I would talk to them seriously and demonstrate that fact by pruning them back hard. And you should get very good new growth next year, and hopefully that encourages the plants to flower well, and from there, pollination and fruit in a year's time.
Thank you. We're kind of continuing the tree theme. Our next question is, I have a cherry tree which seems to have woodworm. What do you advise?
I associate woodworm with furniture. I don't associate it with living trees. But if you're using that term as a descriptive visual of having insects boring into your fruit tree, without being in front of the plant, it's difficult to give any specific advice. But a chemical that I think is still available and that you should be able to purchase and has a sort of broad spectrum use is known as Bordeaux mixture. And you might want to try, again through the winter months, you might want to try and paint that on. And when I mean paint, I mean you are using a brush and you're putting it over the main areas where you're seeing the damage, the holes, and that might help inhibit some of the damage you're getting. Don't forget that any living item on this planet, ourselves included, by the fact of being alive, are a host to something else. We are a food source for something else. Sometimes that's a symbiotic arrangement, sometimes it's not. And particularly for fruit trees, the older they get, they may take on an appearance of being gnarled and look quite dramatic, and are sometimes still incredibly resilient and still produce good volumes of fruit. But the older they are, the more they are going to be playing host to other creatures.
Thank you. The next one is, for the past few years, I have had patches of mushrooms appear in my lawn in late summer, early autumn. It's actually something that happens in my own garden as well, so I'm intrigued as to the response. Is there anything I can do to prevent them coming back?
Well, the first thing to say is, if they're edible, then I don't need to answer this question for you, because you do want them to come back. You are able to boast that you can collect edible mushrooms from your front door, or as the case may be, your back door, and how lucky are you. Conversely, if you've been able to narrow it down to a species, then well done. You haven't suggested they are in a ring. There are so-called fairy rings, which is a very specific, it's very obvious, it's very visual, but that is referring to a specific type of mycorrhiza in the fruiting bodies, the visual mushrooms. Broadly speaking, the reason you will have mycorrhiza, I'm choosing my words carefully here, mycorrhiza, the non-fruiting parts of fungi, are inherently in the soil, inherently, globally, absolutely vital. And it is suggested by some that actually one of the largest, if not the largest, living organism in the world is below soil, and it is a species of mycorrhiza. So they are there, and they have evolved over millions of years, and some are very advantageous and some are not. It is the fruiting bodies that give us an indication that they're there. Those are the mushrooms. when they come up, they might be visual in your lawn for two reasons. We've had experience in the Botanic Gardens, which we've actually thought to be really rather intriguing. When we've lost a tree in the lawn and we've cut it down flush with ground level, but haven't been able to dig the root mass out, or possibly sometimes we've dug out the center of the mass, but left the actual radiating roots. Some years later, we found that fungi living on the roots below ground suddenly are able to send up mushrooms, and they take on the radiating pattern of where the roots are. So that might be one reason. You have a food source below ground in your lawn, historic perhaps, that you inherited, who knows, and fungi have got to the point where they are strong enough to send up fruiting bodies. That's one reason. The other may well be geography, where you are in the world, but particularly if it's an area of heavy rainfall and your lawn doesn't drain well and has a good volume of moss in it, indicative that you're in a wet area, indicative that you don't necessarily have great drainage in your lawn, then grass like that, lawn like that, is holding extra moisture, and that helps perpetuate mycorrhiza in being able to survive and grow. Because they're such an ancient form of life, they need water for consistent, healthy growth.
Thank you. The next one is, when's best to plant autumn flowering bulbs?
Yes, as per my slide earlier with cyclamen, just as an aide-memoire, that we need to plant now for spring bulbs. So the reverse is almost true for autumn. So you might want to order them now, but you want to do spring planting just as the frost is leaving the ground, making your life easier to dig down. But as frost is leaving in spring, that's when you're putting your bulbs in for autumn.
Great, thank you. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to kind of put them in the chat. We've still got kind of plenty of time. I was going to ask, like, what are the kind of best like types of, I guess, like plants or flowers to, I guess, embed now?
To Chloe, I'm going to ask you a question to answer your question. Are you referring to trees and shrubs? Are you referring to perennial plants that will be growing there for multiple years, or are you referring to spring bulbs?
Let's go perennials.
Perennials. This is it's not just a very good time of year, it is the time of year to plant deciduous trees and shrubs, so long as you can work the soil. And I'll give a bit more detail about that phrase in a moment. But trees that are deciduous, in other words, not conifers, not evergreens, trees that are deciduous won't really feel the impact of being lifted and moved. And that might well mean they've been dug up from a field at a commercial nursery, put in the post in our modern world, sent to you, unpacked at home, and not necessarily in the immediate hour they arrived, and then put into your own garden. That's a fairly stressful process for a living item. But because it's done now, when they have dropped their leaves, the plant, for all intents and purposes, has gone into stasis, into hibernation. And so the impact is considerably less dramatic. It does mean that as gardeners, we have the anticipation, let's focus on the positive, the anticipation of seeing it come into bud and leaf in the new growing season, proof that you've done everything right. Of course, conversely, wondering whether it has survived all of that movement and your own gardening skill. And if not, then tragically, you're going to have to wait another season. But deciduous trees, planting now until March, again, until really bud break begins. Once sap is flowing in these plants, that's when there's stress to move them around because they've begun to grow. Now, I mentioned that it's a perfect time to work with deciduous material so long as the soil conditions allow. there are three broad groups of soil: sand, silt, and clay. And then, no surprise, depending where you are in the world, indeed, depending where you might be on any given block, it can change quite dramatically from one end of the street to the other. But you'll get a combination of sand and silt, sand and clay, and that results in slightly different care, but nothing of great concern for today's conversation. What you do need to remember and realize is that a clay soil, particularly in autumn, because of often heavy rains, can become a bit like a quagmire, and you don't want to be walking on that and compressing it, because the reverse of that quagmire is that in the summer months, compressed clay soil without moisture in it will begin to crack, and then you're into creating, well, bricks, but unintentionally. So you may have no choice in the matter. You've got to get plants in the ground now during these autumn months. It has rained hard beforehand. As per my advice, you don't want to be stepping on the soil. That's fine. Put down a plank, put down a board, so that you put that in the bed that you're working on, standing on, and so you're dispersing your weight. And then as you get out of the bed, remove the board and just fork it over. And I don't mean drive the fork into where the board was to the full depth. The phrase is to tickle it over. So maybe you're putting the prongs a third to halfway down into the soil and just aerating the top layer where that compaction is visible. So long as you've got best practice to not compact your soil, planting deciduous plants right now, absolutely perfect. As for plants that you may wish to get in the ground now to enjoy winter or very early spring color, this is a great time to go down to your local shop and get some wallflowers. They may be in trays, they may be in plugs, they may be bare root, and even though they are not deciduous, you'll get them in leaf. You want them in leaf, you'll get a bundle of a dozen or so, and somebody's just lifted them from their patch, and because they've all packed so tight, they've wrapped them around with a bit of hopefully damp hessian or equivalent. They're bare root. You need to plant them up quick as quick. They're not going to survive for long. But wallflowers are wonderful. They'll overwinter and flower early spring. There's various winter shrubs such as sarcococca. I'm not even going to try and spell that without looking it up. Begins with S, multiple O's in it, multiple C's in it, and it's known as winter sweet, and it will produce very small but very delicate scented, beautiful flowers. That's a shrub that you might want to consider. Daphnes, wonderful scent off Daphnes. You could get one from a nursery now, and so long as it's a reasonable size, that will flower midwinter, late winter, early spring, depending where you are, but absolute knockout. So one could go on with that list, but look for winter flora or winter flowering plants and trees and shrubs, winter flowering plants. And yeah, there'll be a few nurseries now that have them, and it's not too late to get them in the ground. They won't be at their best next year because they've only had arguably 6 months in the ground to do their flowering show for you. But in 2024, they'll be wonderful, and thereafter. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll have to make a note of all these later on, so that I don't forget.
You know where I work, Chloe.
Indeed,
I'm happy to answer further questions.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions that have come in. Any advice on making leaf mold from sycamore trees? Sycamore leaves, sorry.
Yeah. The first word is patience, and after that, good practice. So, as I alluded to in one of my slides, here at the Botanics, we collect all of our leaves. We rot them down over 3 years, and by that stage, so it's just the leaves in their own bays. We have 3 bays. This year's bay is slowly filling up as we're beginning to pick up leaves. The middle bay is last year's leaves, so the leaves of 2021. And the third bay is the leaves of 2019. Those are have I got this right? 22, 20, leaves of 2020. Those are what we're using now. And we turn them once a year, bay 1 into bay 2, bay 2 into bay 3. And so it rots down wonderfully, this pure leaf organic material. It's known as leaf mold, wonderfully friable. delight to use. You can use it as a mulch. We use it as a base to make our own potting mixes. That's at large scale. There's no doubt about it. We're picking up leaves from 11 acres. That's large scale. If you want to do it on a much smaller scale, you could have small compost bays. You could store them that way. It's not a very sightly system, but by far the best, easiest is to put them into heavy-duty garbage bags, or if you store the bags from potting mixes that you might purchase from a garden nursery, those wonderful heavy-duty plastic bags, always good to reuse those. Stuff the leaves into there, tie them off at the top. Assuming the leaves have a bit of moisture in them, chances are they will from raking up off the ground and it's rained in previous days, what have you. Grate a bit of moisture in there. Otherwise, add a little bit of moisture. Tie it off at the top, and then you'll need to punch holes. And we're talking about a skewer holes here, nothing more. Punch holes into the leaf mass around the base of the bag and put them to one side. And you might want to check once a year. You might want to dump them out and put them back in just to aerate them and help them rot down. But otherwise, 24 to 36 months later, you've got leaf mold.
So patience is key, as Marcus said. Our next question is, we have 2 much older lavender and rosemary bushes, both doing well. However, when is the best time to cut them back, and how far back should we do it?
Oh, lavender and rosemary, I'm hearing. Okay. First off, let's remember where they come from. They're a Mediterranean plant, a warm temperate plant. They have therefore evolved to be coastal plants, often growing in very poor mineral soil. They're not necessarily long-lived plants. And what I mean by that is, if you have a plant that's 15 years old, you're doing very well. 20, exceptional. So you have to recognize that an old plant is a good plant per se, but won't live forever. And therefore, if you cut them hard back, part of their growth habit is to if we don't prune them annually or certainly every 2 years, they get what's called leggy. So the tip growth is where all the leaves are, and the plant won't produce new growth behind, so you get the very evident woody branches. If you want to keep a plant like that with dense growth all the time, you need to prune it regularly every 12 to 24 months. So cutting into the old wood, you have to be prepared that the plant may not respond. But assuming you're not going at it with shears and that you're doing careful pruning per stem with secateurs, try and look for a nodal point, so where the leaf bud is that's active as far back as possible, or look to where once upon a time, often it's a little ring around the stem, look where there was a ring, prune just above that by 1 millimeter or 2, and that might activate the plant for the next growing season to think, right, I can regrow from that dormant bud point. Ideally, if you want to try and keep these old plants going and have them as bushy as possible, look at it as a 2 to 3 year plan. So take it back by 1/3 now to where there are active leaf buds, let those grow out next year, and hopefully that'll promote a bit of growth behind them as well. Prune back behind that, and you might be able to regenerate the plant that way. But overall, lovely to have old rosemary and old lavender, but recognize that you may need to take cutting material and start young stock again.
Thank you. The next question is, any plans to have in-person garden tours? I guess I can kind of say from an alumni perspective, we did organize an in-person alumni tour to coincide with the gin tasting, so it did have a kind of dual aspect to it, but that took place in the summer. I'm sure there will be more alumni specific activities in the gardens maybe next year, but Mark, I guess there's also I don't know if there's kind of wider plans that maybe you will have, so that you might want to elaborate on.
My head gardener, Richard Walker, and I have been giving tours over the last 4 months now, perhaps, and it's been a huge pleasure to have various groups both request an on-site tour and for Richard and I to be able to give in-person walkabouts once again. Both personally, but I think collectively, it's important to be reminded at all times that COVID, and indeed it is now being suggested winter flu, is COVID's still around, let's not forget that, and winter flu may become quite dominant. So we need to continue to be careful. Now, the beauty of an outdoor tour is just that. You can't get better ventilation than outdoors. And so for any of you who are listening today and local enough to request a tour, we don't do one-on-one. That means just come by and have a chat with us. We'd be delighted to chat with you. But if you're part of a gardening group and you think that there might be an opportunity for a tour to be organised with Richard and I, then please make contact. And with the present scene of COVID and flu, while being careful, obviously less restrictions, we're happy to try and oblige.
Perfect. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to kind of pop them in the chat. If not, that might kind of be a nice little point to end on. So thank you as always, Mark. It's always great to kind of listen to you, and I always learn some things. I kind of obviously get to chat to Mark out with these sessions, and he knows some of my gardening woes already, but it's always great to kind of learn more. And thank you so much to everyone for their patience with my sound issues at the beginning. As I said, lesson learned, always do events at home and not in the office for me from now on. So yeah, thanks again for everyone's patience, and I hope you enjoyed the session today, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your days wherever you're joining us from. So thank you.
Chloe, regardless of your technical issues, thank you so much for making this possible.
No problem. Thanks as always. So yes, thanks to everyone, and yeah, have a great time.
Take care, everyone.